Fiery 49 fans? Today we are starting to dive into the electrical system on Fiery 49. If you've seen some of the previous pictures, you know the truck is very original, but the one thing that is not is the electrical system. Someone at some point took this truck, which originally was a 6-volt truck equipped with a generator, and it's had a conversion to an alternator and a 12-volt system. Appears to mostly have been okay, at least from the alternator side of things, but you can see some components missing, wires hanging, modifications. Under the dash is the real mess. It's kind of a rat's nest. There was a lot of things done in conversions from the 6-volt to the 12-volt to try and adapt 6-volt systems to the 12-volt resistors. There are resistors on the walls, different things. You can see some wires have melted, which is never a good sign. But the main thing we're trying to do today, we know the truck, when it's running, is not charging the battery. So the alternator that is down in here, older style alternator, one wire, but we know the truck's not charging. The only thing we have checked on the system prior to now, before starting the truck, was just to make sure that none of that wiring had a short to ground, because the way it works is that wire that you see on top of the alternator, that one wire alternator, that wire goes through, and that's actually what charges the battery. On this particular truck, the way it is set up, the truck does not have a voltmeter. It still has an old style amp meter. The way an amp meter works to show charging or discharge, the wire comes off the alternator, it follows through here. They've got it going in the firewall, and it comes inside to the amp meter. And the way the amp meter works is all of the power on that line actually has to go through the amp meter, so it is wired directly in line with the charging line. So the wire from the alternator comes to here, it goes back out, and then this truck does not go directly back to the battery. It goes to a terminal on top of the starter where the battery connects to the starter. This truck, you can see the wire down there. Single battery cable goes to the top of the starter, and that's kind of the junction block for several other feeders off of it. But this wire right here, that you can see something else has melted to it at some point, but that comes off the back of the amp meter and goes down to the block where the large battery cable also feeds the starter. So that completes the circuit, and if the alternator is working and producing power, in a perfect world, it comes out of the alternator, goes through the firewall to the amp meter we showed inside, comes out of the back side of the amp meter, back around, down to the starter, and then onto the battery. That's how it charges. All we've done, like I said, we made sure we did not have a short to ground, which we don't, because that would have been bad. If we'd have put the battery in with a short to ground on that system, there would have been sparks, smoke, more melting of wires, that stuff. So no big deal. But just to see, I'll show quickly how we checked that circuit for a couple things. One, the short to ground, an ohm meter on it to the truck ground, and then over to the alternator, and had infinite resistance, which means no short to ground. If you'd have very low resistance, you've got a short. But since we had infinite resistance, that means there was no gap of bridging. But to start the process of trying to diagnose this circuit, let me see if I can get a view here. But simple test light, a couple bucks at a park store. Doesn't have to be a big fancy expensive one. Just a 12-volt bulb in there, and this pointer goes down. If I can coordinate this while holding the camera, but check my ground. So the way it works is we're just looking for a ground, and prior to me trying to film this, this ground worked, but just a body ground. This is a negative ground system. Find a better angle here. If all is well in the world, we touch the starter at the post that has power, and you can see the test lights on and off. So we know we have power to the top of our block where the wire comes in for the alternator. And also we do not have a short to ground. So checking that, we'll leave our ground on here. Luckily I have enough cable here, we can stretch it out. We'll go to the other end of the circuit, down to the alternator. And where the cable goes into the alternator, if we put that on there, you can see the test light does light up. So we have a complete circuit, and power is getting to the alternator from the block, so we know the one-wire alternator has a complete circuit. to its charging port, and also has power getting there. The battery is connected this time, so that's what we should find, but we're not charging. So we'll go back and very quickly show how we checked the truck for a short to ground before we ever put a battery in, before we did anything to the truck. Fairly simple. Obviously this battery is not of the correct group to fit in this truck, but it's one we had around. We know it's a good battery, so we're using it just for testing purposes. But cheapo $10 multimeter from your bargain store outlet. We have one end here on the ground, and that particular meter has a tone when you have a complete circuit, and you can see the resistance was 0. So that's a complete circuit. That is not what we want between the positive side and the negative side of the truck. Positive battery cable here. This should be a separate circuit, so we do not want a closed circuit here. You can see we didn't get a tone, although we do have some resistance. So that means there is a circuit available, but it has very high resistance. Now things are in line here. You have the alternator, the windings, different things, and obviously we have an alternator that's not charging. I'll have to look the specs up on what we should have, but we don't have a closed circuit, so we don't get fire and smoke and sparks when we hook the battery up. But we do have an alternator that's not charging, and we're diagnosing that. But that's the quick and easy check for ground. So no short to ground, but we do have a circuit in place, and like I said, that can be a certain amount is normal for the components, and a vehicle has its own specifications. You know, this older truck, there's not much there, but newer vehicles, you'll see plenty of that between the always powered up computer systems, that kind of stuff. So anyway, no short to ground, and that's how you check it. All right, let's see if this alternator will cooperate, be nice, come off easily. The first thing we've ensured, the battery is disconnected, because as we mentioned, this wire here, that wire goes directly from the alternator basically to the battery. It goes to a terminal on top of the starter. So that is normally 12 volts hot, and if we were to take that off and the battery was still connected, that could find a short to ground and burn things up. So we want to avoid that. So the battery is disconnected on the positive and the negative terminals. We'll get that off out of the way, and then hopefully these bolts that probably haven't been out in a very long time cooperate, and we get this alternator off fairly quickly. All right, had a little camera fumble there on the end. It decided to fall over as this came out of the truck, but here's the alternator from the truck. You can see here, battery positive. That's where the line to the amp meter and to the battery came from. That's what actually charges, or should be charging, the battery, but it is not doing so. The ground here, there was no cable on the ground. I'm assuming, I probably should have checked before I took it out, but I'm assuming this is probably a case ground. That would be for something where, for whatever reason, the alternator doesn't ground to the engine, but this one, the case, metal brackets directly to the engine, should be a case ground. But that is the way I should have checked that on the truck. Was I should have basically gone to this ground terminal if it needed to be grounded, and check to see if it was in fact grounding to the vehicle or not. It may be something as simple as the ground, the connections in here. The alternator didn't have a ground. If you don't have the ground, it doesn't have the start circuit can't start the charging process. But mechanically looks to be in good shape. Obviously the truck itself has 6,700 miles. I don't know when the 12 volt conversion happened for the truck, but okay, just to show what I should have done while this was still on the truck, I got ahead of myself, but made an assumption, but that can bite you sometimes. Got the old El Cheapo multimeter back out, but obviously this is labeled ground here, did not have a wire on it on the truck, but I was making the assumption that this was a case grounded alternator, or at least had the ability. And if we get the multimeter out, one to ground, one to the case, a little dirty, but you can hear there's the tone. So this is grounded, so the wire was not needed if this was making good connection with the tabs on the truck. I'm going to go back over and check the brackets on the truck and make sure that I can get a ground showing there. If not, it may just be the case wasn't grounded, and that's why the alternator couldn't excite and start charging the system. But if I do have a ground there, this is good. We're going to assume something wrong with the alternator, and we may just go get it checked and see how that's going too, just for peace of mind and to see what's going on. But anyway, that's what I should have checked before I took it off the truck, and I didn't. But simple as that. That's what I should have done. All right, excellent news. We checked the ground, full the alternator, case to ground, that all looked good. Actually came over to the truck, trying to figure out why, if there's anything with the truck that may cause the alternator not to work, and actually checked the brackets that hold the alternator to make sure they were showing ground with the ohm meter, and they were. So I was a little worried that the alternator was going to be bad, so we took it over to a local service, P&D service, one of those little homegrown, in the garage, by the house type services, the kind of place you want to go, the kind of people that actually know what they're working with, know how to actually make the repairs, not just put something on the machine and check it out. But he put it on his tester, checked it out, and the alternator is working fine. It's putting out the 80 amps it's rated for. Starts right up, kicks in. So this alternator, there's nothing wrong with it. We know there's nothing wrong with the positive side of the circuit that it charges through. So just have a grounding issue, which means since the ground is good here, and we had the ground was in place with the brackets, we simply did not have a good electrical connection on the ground side between the case of the alternator and the brackets that hold it. So we're going to take some emery cloth or some sandpaper, something we can find here, and clean up the connection points, these mating surfaces here. Just get those clean, make sure when we put the alternator back on that it has a good grounded connection to the engine block, which is also the chassis ground, and then this thing should be fine, and we should have a charging system that operates. So we're going to work on that. Won't be anything crazy. We'll just clean these painted areas, get the rust corrosion. This is probably something that simply was a corrosion issue from the truck sitting, and we should be able to clean it up and have a operational charging system. Alright, so it's hard to show while holding the camera, but we've just taken a wire brush and cleaned up the brackets that the alternator mounts to. Cleaned that up, and now we have a good positive ground surface, or at least we should. We'll check it with the ohm meter, make sure that we do have a good ground, and then once the alternator is back in the brackets, we'll check and make sure that we have a ground to that. So, but once we have that grounded, we'll hook back up, and we should be able to start the truck and ensure that we have a charging system that is operating. Alright, as you can see, the alternator is back in, it's back on. We'll have to do some belt alignment. It's obviously not where it needs to be, but we can shim that out. But the main thing, we now have cleaned all the connections, it's bolted up, and now confirming what I should have done before, that it is grounded, which means we have a complete circuit, and based on the fact that it tested good, we should have a operational charging system. So let's fire it up and see what happens. Alright, so we've put the battery cables back on the incorrect size battery that doesn't quite fit in the truck. As you can see, without the truck running, we're at 13.45, basically 13.5 volts. So this battery did just come off the charger, so it should be pretty close to full charge, but we should see an increase in the voltage once we start the truck. So let's go fire it up and see what we get. Alright, Moved around the truck. 12.6, truck is not running. Let's fire it up and see what happens. And there we go. Voltage coming up. That is about the voltage the regulator should be running at, so 13.5 volts at idle. Excellent. Looks like we've got a truck that is now charging its own battery, which means we can drive on down the road a little bit later on. So we still have a lot of electrical to sort out. We have a well-running engine and a charging system that is now charging the battery, so we can drive around. But the headlights are not working. No marker lights. I'm sure that has a lot to do with what's under the dash. We've had a few wires we had to remove because they were melted. That may be something we actually disconnected in taking some of the wiring off. But the one thing that does still work, hey, I'll take it. That's pretty cool. So more work to do to get all these systems functioning, but the engine's running, mechanically in good shape, fuel system's good, and now we have a charging system, so it can charge its own battery. So we're getting much closer to taking this thing down the road for a spin on its own and